The global financial crisis is having a devastating impact on poor countries. The International Monetary Fund is demanding urgent action by the international community and to raise at least $25 billion this year. But is helping the poor countries still a priority for the troubled rich world? And can donor countries keep their promises to double aid to Africa by 2010? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. The global financial crisis is having a destructive effect on third world economies. The International Monetary Fund is warning that the economic downturn could create a widespread humanitarian crisis in the world's most vulnerable countries. The IMF has called on richer nations to raise $25 billion in the next 12 months. But if conditions get worse, the figure needed could rise to $140 billion. As the more developed nations tighten their purse strings, foreign investment is expected to fall by 20%. Money sent home by migrant workers is also likely to decline. There are concerns that social costs of failing economies could cause political unrest and even conflicts. It's estimated that if conditions continue to get any worse, anything from 1.4 to 2.8 million children could die between now and 2015. The IMF's managing director, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, revealed the organization's predictions this week and urged the body to stick to its old commitments. He said, after hitting first the advanced economies and then the emerging economies, a third wave from the global financial crisis is now hitting the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. I urge donors to rise to the challenge and provide the financing needed to preserve these hard-won gains that many low-income countries have made over the past decade and prevent a humanitarian crisis. Well, joining us today are our guests in Washington, D.C., Hugh Breedenkamp, one of the authors of the report and Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the International Monetary Fund. In Oxford, Paul Collier, Director for the Centre for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford, and author of The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. And in Doha, Ibrahim Owais, an international economic advisor and professor of economics at Georgetown University. Mr. Breedenkamp, you say that at least $25 billion is needed. Is that what these countries really need?
Well, as we say in the study, the needs could even be greater than that. What we've focused on roughly 1/3 of low-income countries that will have urgent balance of payments needs just to keep their foreign exchange reserves at what we would consider comfortable levels in 2009. On that basis, we estimate the needs at $25 billion for 2009. But as we stress in the report, first of all, there may be some countries that don't have urgent balance of payments needs but do need support to protect their budgets and to make sure that they can sustain an adequate level of public expenditure during the downturn. And we also emphasize that the prospects this year are very uncertain. The global crisis could well turn out to have a more severe impact globally and on low-income countries than we are currently projecting. And if that is the case, obviously the financing needs could rise further.
How can you justify promoting aid? Between 1970 and 1998, when aid flows to Africa were at their peak, poverty in Africa rose from 11% to 66%.
Yeah, those decades were very difficult ones for Africa and for the developing world in general. But what we saw in the last decade, since the late 1990s, was that the policy reforms that these countries put in place painstakingly during the 90s finally started to pay off. We started to see rapid growth throughout the low-income country community. We saw inflation coming down. The debt relief initiatives dug these countries out of a big debt hole. And so we saw significant improvements in economic performance, and poverty was starting to improve in many countries. That's one reason why it's particularly important that we not allow, we, the international community, do not allow this global recession to set back all the progress that has been made in the last decade.
Okay, Mr. Collier, do you believe that this is the right way to go, or do you think that this report is just a waste of money?
No, I think it is the right way to go. I think what's happened is it's tragic that the poorest countries, the bottom billion, have been hit by a bus. Who was driving the bus? It was the governments of the rich countries. The countries of the bottom billion are not responsible for this mess, but they're suffering from it. And so it's our responsibility in the rich countries to try and shield them from it.
Okay, Mr. Owais, I mean,
First
many
and foremost,
critics, sorry, excuse me interrupting, let me bring in Mr. Owais here. Many of the critics of the IMF, these developed countries, say that they are responsible for much of the shortfalls happening in Africa.
This is very true. The industrial nations, the United States in particular, is responsible for this financial mess in the world. After 8 years of the administration of the Bush administration and mismanagement, greed, and a number of other reasons, but the sufferings in the third world countries are far beyond what the report of the IMF is just referring to. In fact, I would have much preferred that there would be certain case studies in depth about what is happening to particular countries in Africa, in particular, where the poverty had prevailed and the famine is spreading, unemployment is increasing, and therefore the human tragedy there, or the human misery there, is beyond any measurement. So the $25 billion, in my opinion, is only a drop in a bucket compared
But you also brought up the fact that many of these countries suffer from different problems. Mr. Bredenkamp, how can you put all these countries in one basket when putting together this report? Surely their problems differ greatly.
that is why
The problems do differ greatly, and obviously that's a challenge when you write a report like this. You're covering a huge range of countries across the globe with different kinds of problems. You know, some countries, for example, as the commodity prices have dropped this year, oil prices have come down, food prices have come down. That has benefited some of the countries that were importing these products last year, but it also now hurts the exporters of those commodities. So there's a huge income shift going on between countries. It's also true that you know, these countries are much more vulnerable to the shocks than the richer countries. You have many more people living close to or even below subsistence levels, so any shock that hits their incomes or that raises the prices of the products that they need to survive has a much more damaging effect on their welfare than is the case in the more advanced economies.
Mr. Collier, you write a lot about the bottom billion and the bottom dollar there. What are their needs, and how would that fall into this IMF report?
It is brought in. The IMF report is careful to discuss social safety nets and increased spending on social safety nets. But I just want to say we're in danger of talking Africa down. Africa is going to be hit by this shock, is being hit by this shock, but actually it's still going to be growing. It's the rich countries that have managed really to shoot themselves in the foot. And so in relative terms, Africa now looks more promising than the economies of the rich countries. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. The tragedy for the bottom billion is that they're already so poor that being hit by this shock, which they were not responsible for, is a call for action from us to help them. But it's not a shock that is as devastating to their economies as it is to our own. So they're not that risky an environment anymore.
Mr. Owais, isn't it rather patronizing? There's a call initially for $25 billion. If you look at the bailout of AIG Insurance in the US, one of the main donors for IMF, that's at least 6 times as much. Are the priorities right here?
Well, I think that over the years we found out the responsibility of the industrial nations of the world had been dwindling vis-a-vis the third world countries. From the time when Robert McNamara was the president of the World Bank, when he asked for 1% of the GDP to be allocated to aid to third world countries, that percentage had been reduced substantially year after year. So there is some sort of lack of responsibility that I see amongst the industrial nations, and particularly at the time now when the world recession is affecting almost every nation around the globe in varying degrees. I think that this is the time that there should be more international cooperation to help those countries, because as had been mentioned, this is a country, a continent particularly of Africa. It is full of resources, and it actually can develop and can grow much faster with some help, financial help, and try very much to get them away from any sort of reversal of the free trade or the condition that the IMF had been imposing on those countries for reforms, and we find out that now there is a call for nationalization of...
Okay, well, that's very interesting, and I'd like to pick up on that point after the break, because we are going to take a short break now. But when we come back, what happened to those old commitments? Has the money been delivered? Well, stay with us.